Hello, you're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News, live from COP26 here in Glasgow. Today, more money pledged for green finance as Chancellor Rishi Sunak claims a $130 trillion promise from private firms is historic. But countries on the front line of the climate crisis say rich nations have not delivered the cash promised over a decade ago. We see the impact in Madagascar as whole towns are facing ecological destruction and deforestation is the only way for some to survive. And protests in Glasgow as demonstrators say companies are claiming to do more to protect the environment than they really are. Welcome to the Daily Climate Show. We are live for you from the heart of the COP26 summit here in Glasgow. And there's been lots of talk about money here today. The promise of an eye-watering $130 trillion of private capital to help fund the green transition was described by the former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney as a watershed moment. But a long-standing promise by developed countries to fund $100 billion a year for those on the front line of the climate crisis will be met 3 years late. Well, we'll hear more about both of those shortly. But first, more than 1 million people are on the brink of famine. In Madagascar, it's a country experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. As crops and livestock have been devastated, many are now turning to deforestation just to survive. But that, in turn, is making the climate emergency worse. Our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, reports now from Focap in the Grand Sud region of Madagascar.
The shifting sand in Focap in the southern tip of Madagascar blankets everything. It's threatening livelihoods and burying homes and buildings. This was the police station. And this, the local government office, now so covered we're able to stand on its roof. The phenomenon known here as Tiumina, or red storm, has been dramatically changing this Indian Ocean coastline, ravaging crops and stifling development. The people here have been hit by a long drought, but also fierce winds, which often halt the fishing, which is one of the main sources of income. Henri Claude, the head of the village, hasn't been out on the water for more than a week now. Some of the brave, or the desperate, opt for other methods, but it can be dangerous and often fruitless. Henri Claude shows us the rows of sisal trees the villagers planted to try to restore this degraded land and rescue the ecosystem. It's a long-term strategy with the greenest of weapons.
How worried are you that even more of the village is going to be buried in sand?
Many of them are just plain scared, not just of the future, but the here and now. We're afraid of living here, he says, and many people are leaving. They're afraid of the invasion by the dunes, and we just can't get investment here. The violent winds blow off roofs and make a living that's already hard even harder. And there are signs many of the villagers have already abandoned their homes and been forced to move on. So they're turning to other ways to survive. And by the look of this market, Madagascar's forests are being plundered and sold at an alarming rate. But all this has added to large-scale deforestation, with Madagascar losing 40% of its forests since the 1950s. We don't have anything to eat, we don't have anything to drink. We cut the wood because of the kere, he says. Cassie will be lucky if she sells any of her sweet potatoes. She'll maybe make 2,000 ariary, about $50, but she has 7 other children, as well as her baby. It's hard, she says. I'll spend half on water and half on rice for the baby. The others won't eat today. And right now, Madagascar is burning away its future to get through the present, racking up one of the highest rates of deforestation in any tropical country. That's put its ecosystem at risk. destroying its habitat and putting the vast range of unique wildlife it's home to in great danger. We spotted an extremely rare radiated tortoise out in the open and lifted it away from the road. It's critically endangered and only found here in the south of Madagascar, but it's being killed for its meat or captured by poachers at such a rate that conservationists warn it could disappear from the wild forever within 20 years. The people of this island are among the poorest in the world, yet the country has an abundance of natural riches, with more than 100 different species of lemur living in the wild, for instance. And the island so large, it's more than double the size of Britain, that there are different but equally serious problems across the nation, as we found when we travelled here into the forest on the eastern coast. Sinji's been travelling through this forest for 2 decades. He's never seen it so bad.
It's not good, the change. The change coming hot, high, hot, and dry. Dry, and the rain coming, if they come, rain too much, no stop, and flood everywhere.
The Malagasy government has so many tough challenges, and weaning its population off its dependence on coal and wood is just one of them. And right now, for so many here, raiding the nation's natural resources is seen as the only way to survive. Alex Crawford, Sky News in the Grand Sud region of Madagascar.
Well, let's return now to the developments that have been taking place here at the COP26 summit today. Day 3, where finance has been the focus. And despite announcements on both private and public funds, there is anger from climate vulnerable nations that there's still not enough money being put forward to help address the issues that they're facing right now. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports.
In a way, this summit is all about money, moving cash away from fossil fuels and seeing more flow to poor countries most at risk from climate change. Today, a slew of announcements on new streams of green finance.
My simple goal is that the message we want coming out loud and clear from Glasgow is that whatever climate ambitions we set over the next couple of weeks, the finance is there to deliver them.
It finally looks like that much-needed climate funding has finally started to arrive. But everyone in this room knows it's nothing like enough cash flowing fast enough to meet the scale of the challenge.
Do countries like Madagascar, for example, which is living in the climate emergency, feel confident that investment is about to start flowing their way?
La réponse est absolument non. Le gap de financement qui avait été promis à l'accord de Paris, c'est-à-dire la COP 21, il y a 5 ans, n'est toujours pas arrivé. Et les pays du Sud, comme Madagascar, qui font face très difficilement au changement climatique, ont besoin de ce financement pour mettre en place leur politique d'adaptation, mais surtout pour faire face aux urgences. Et c'est maintenant qu'il faut que ça soit débloqué.
For the Bahamas, hit in 2019 by Dorian, the most powerful Atlantic hurricane ever recorded, it's about fairness shown to those who suffer by those who pollute.
My yesterday is your tomorrow. I had my Dorian. What will yours be? And without the finances being made available and loosen up, we will not be able to adapt. We will not be able to mitigate. And who will it be next? You, who hoard, stockpile, keep the resources to yourselves. You will not be safe unless we are all safe.
But the idea at this summit, launched today by the energetic money men, is that trillions in cash will follow the billions in public money. Now financial institutions have agreed to go to net zero too.
Look, the city has mobilized the finance. It's led on this. There's more than enough capital committed today than the world needs for the next 30 years.
But can we believe the banks when they say they'll walk away from fossil fuel profits?
What we need to do is transition. We're rewiring the whole economy into a more sustainable economy. From our perspective, we've committed to end harmful financing. So, for example, oil and gas is less than 0.8% of the lending on our balance sheet. We have been reducing that. And with those customers that we do have, we're only going to work with them if they have a credible transition plan aligned with Paris.
No single summit could switch the world's economy away from fossil fuels, and we won't fix the climate crisis until that happens. But COP26 looks like it has at least set that process in motion.
Well, Tom is here in the studio with me now. 130 trillion sounds like a lot of money, but questions about just how ready and available that money is for net zero investments.
Absolutely, Sam. As Mark Carney said to me earlier, if they had that money, that's 30 years' worth of decarbonisation into the future. It would pretty much get this project massively off onto the right track. But you've got to remember, it's a bit like one of those financial adverts. This is how much your investment could be worth if everything falls into line. And yet, it hasn't yet done that. Although the requirements put out by Rishi Sunak today for reporting of your carbon exposure, your net zero targets, that is mandatory. The rest of this is all guidance. This is what we want to see financial institutions to do. How much they'll actually fall in line with that, we don't yet know. And that's why developing countries are still pretty sceptical about all of this. Are we actually going to see that money? And the reason they are is they want to see that $100 billion they were promised back in Paris actually hit the deadline, which is, next year, which was actually this year, but it looks like it's going to be next year. If they can get that, that will help boost confidence. What Rishi Sunak and Mark Carney would tell you, once you have that public money available, these other trillions will start to follow. But again, until that money's there on the table, I think they need to restore that trust. And that's what this summit really is always going to be about, is rebuilding that trust.
Yeah, signalling value. OK, Tom, thank you. Well, we have heard a lot of big numbers today here at the COP26 summit in both billions and trillions, as we were hearing from public and private sources. But what do these figures actually all mean, and who is spending what? Well, Sky's economics editor Ed Conway has all the details.
This is supposedly Finance Day at COP, but it might better be called Big Numbers Day. I'm going to show you why. We've heard lots of big numbers today. I mean, one of them was $130 trillion. The other was $100 billion. We're all getting a bit number blind here. So let's just kind of go into what these actually mean, starting with $130 trillion. Now, the starting point for this is imagine all of the assets in the world, everything, investments, you've got mortgages, the whole thing. It's about $300 trillion, give or take. It's a big number. And what this is talking about is that firms that control about $130 trillion have committed to the Glasgow Finance Agreement on net zero. They're saying that they're going to control those investments so they keep to net zero. It doesn't mean that all of that slice is actually going towards spending money on solar panels or renewables, but it does mean that those companies are really behind net zero. It doesn't mean, I should say, that the rest of them, so that remaining two-thirds, aren't in favour of net zero. It just means they haven't signed up to it yet. So this is kind of a formalisation of where the financial system is, more of them committing to these kinds of agreements. That's the $130 trillion, slightly meaningless, if you ask me, but $100 billion is a bit more tangible. This is about the money that rich countries are promising to give to poorer countries to help them mitigate climate change and convert to renewables and so on. And the hope was to get that up to $100 billion by 2020. And here's where things actually stand. So in recent years, you can see we've got up to kind of nearly 80 billion by 2019, but we're not going to hit that. Obviously, we didn't hit it in 2020, we know that. We're not going to hit it this year, which was the hope. It looks more like 2023. You can see that's when the bar goes above that line. But here's the thing, again, this is quite complicated, and what we should do is just focus on one of these bars. So let's look at 2018 and break it down. It's about 78 billion in total, but of that, OK, we'll take that 78 billion. Of that, a good chunk is the private sector rather than the public sector, so companies giving money to poorer countries, some as export credits as well. And if we drill into that public sector bit specifically, of that 61.6 billion, the vast majority, 47 billion or so, is loans. So it's not giving money, it's actually lending money and expecting it to be repaid. Fair enough, but it's slightly different to what people describe this typically as. And of that total, you might be wondering, how much is the UK? Well, it's that red slice, $1.6 billion or so. It's actually a little bit less than you might have expected, which is strange, given the UK is encouraging other countries to pay more.
Well, let's take a look at some of the other day's news now from COP26 and, of course, around the world. The Prime Minister has returned to Westminster and has been reflecting on whether COP26 will be successful in keeping the warming target of 1.5 degrees alive. Well, Boris Johnson told MPs that words still need to be turned into action to avoid climate disaster.
In the end, Mr. Speaker, it is a question of will. We have the technology to do what is necessary. All that remains in question is our resolve. The negotiations in Glasgow have almost 2 weeks to run, but we can take heart from what has been achieved so far.
Well, McLaren has unveiled its new extreme e-car at COP26. There it is. Prince Charles was one of the first to see the British-based team's offering for the off-road electric race series, which aims to raise awareness about climate change by racing in environments that are already suffering from the effects of global warming. He's been busy. Prince Charles has also been dipping his toe in the sustainable fashion world, teaming up with Stella McCartney and Leonardo DiCaprio, who also made another COP26 appearance. The designer is showcasing sustainable fashion options and technologies at a COP26 event, calling for better environmental regulation in the industry.
We're probably the most unfashionable industry and the most behind industry, really, which is shocking. Our industry has taken too long, I think, primarily because we have no policies in place. We're not regulated in any way, and I'm really pleading with the politicians here to give us some guidelines.
And Australia has employed goats in an effort to reduce devastating wildfires. A 40-strong herd are chewing their way through undergrowth that can fuel wildfires across high-risk areas in New South Wales. Ministers say the use of grazing goats are in response to a recommendation of the independent inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfires. Now, there have been big protests in Glasgow today, with thousands of people taking part in an anti-greenwashing protest. Our correspondent James Matthews was there, and he sent us this report.
There's been a lot of talk about the police operation at COP26. Here, for the first time, it was put to the test. What started out as a protest against so-called greenwashing by industry and government and against the Cambo oil field evolved into these scenes in the centre of Glasgow. A march that hadn't been arranged in advance with the police splintered into different city streets. Groups of demonstrators were pursued by police officers at pace. This wasn't a riot, but there was some confrontation in a situation that was fluid. In a police operation involving officers from around the UK, this was City of London police dealing with demonstrators who locked themselves onto the building of the firm SSE. Over the course of the day, a small number of arrests were made, and some police officers had paint sprayed in their faces. In the thick of it all were protesters with a point to make.
So this demonstration is about how so many companies are spending more money to make themselves look green than they are spending on actually making the change that is necessary to protect our planet.
At the end of the day, this is an existential threat to humanity, and we need to be doing all that we can. We need to be led by the science.
This is what we've seen over the past couple of hours. Police lines trying to contain demonstrators street by street in an effort to secure the city centre. But it's been a very fluid situation. If protesters were prevented from making their way through the city centre, Nessie, the Loch Ness monster, was stopped from swimming up the River Clyde. It had been a gesture by anti-poverty campaigners until police ruled it out.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking to come up the road, please.
Politics in all its form has come to Glasgow. If they didn't know it before, they do now. James Matthews, Sky News, Glasgow.
Well, we're discussing all of those climate issues of the day now with Senior Teaching Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies and founder of Safinda, Felicia Jackson, and the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme at the University of Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, Dr. Ben Caldecott. Good evening to both of you. It's been a busy day, hasn't it? And Ben, I want to come to you first. $130 trillion. It sounds like a hell of a lot of money, doesn't it? But it's not a pot of money that's just sitting there. It's not an investment fund, is it?
No, it's not. It's not a pot of money in a bank account or an investment fund, but it is all the assets that have committed to net zero by 2050, and those assets have also committed to interim targets to make sure that they make progress. There's still a lot to do, though, and I think one of the things that we need to spend much more time on is focusing on the integrity of those commitments. How are we going to make sure that people's promises are implemented. And that's why we need to invest in tracking infrastructure and make sure that governance arrangements are in place. And that was why the announcement this morning from Rishi Sunak is really very significant, because he was talking about the need for net zero transition plans across the economy that creates a new, first-of-a-kind regulatory framework for companies and financial firms to think about these issues. Very big announcement.
Yeah, mandatory reporting from 2023. That's a big step, isn't it, Felicia?
It is a big step, but it's a fundamental one. I mean, one of the key issues with any announcement about commitments is where is the accountability? And I think anyone who makes a commitment today knows that they're going to be tracked. They know that they're going to be asked what they're going to do and by when. But in the end, we need to get an alignment of all companies and all financial institutions towards the same goal. Otherwise, we're not going to encourage the financial flows that we need.
130 trillion, as we're saying, it's not a pot of money sitting there, but it's still a lot of money, isn't it? And you've got to think that if you can't solve the climate crisis with that amount of money, then should we just give up?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting and that was said this morning is that that amount of assets under management means that we could relatively easily do the 100 trillion that we actually need to affect the low carbon transition. But again, the question is, what are the frameworks that are encouraging that money to be invested in the right way? One of the big challenges is a lot of those financial institutions are still heavily invested in fossil fuels. And as long as that's the case, we're not really going to get to the transition as quickly as we need.
Questions about who's going to be monitoring this. 2050 is the target date, isn't it, for those assets under management? But you can't just have a sudden sort of killing of an industry, can you? You have to sort of unwind it gradually. What do you think about that?
So this 130 trillion needs to be guided by transition plans with regular reporting of progress, and that needs to be put on a regulatory footing, and the UK is the first to do that. And in addition to that, of course, we need to make sure that the real economy, the changes that are happening around the world, people that are affected, companies that are affected, get the capital they need, get the support they need. And one of the things we need to do is to convert polluting companies into clean ones, and they're going to need capital to do that. So we need financial markets to provide them with the resources they need to transition as well.
The other pots of money that, of course, we've been talking about is that $100 billion a year that was pledged in 2009 in Copenhagen. Looks like, I mean, we're certainly going to fall short. Talk of it being met in 2023. Have you seen promising signs around that, Felicia?
Very much so. I mean, there have been so many different announcements. It was a huge problem when it was announced that it wasn't going to be met, because obviously that undermines the trust in the negotiations, people's ability. Exactly. But with some of the announcements we've seen in the last couple of days, you know, Japan, a number of countries have actually said they're going to contribute larger amounts of climate finance. I think the key thing is the overall transition, because 100 billion is a drop in the ocean in terms of the amount of money that's actually needed. What the 100 billion is about is public commitment from developed countries to say, you know, we're asking you to take action and we're going to stand up to the plate and provide you with the funds and the support and the capacity building that you need to do a just transition, because as Ben says, you know, you have to be able to transition people's jobs, their livelihoods, the way in which they work. So the South African announcement I thought was brilliant. You know, 8.5 billion to actually transition an economy that's a huge contributor to emissions.
Yeah, final thought from you, Ben, about that South African announcement. Of course, an economy that's hugely dependent on coal.
So a really significant announcement and a first of a kind, and something that can be replicated. So developed economies, including the UK, the US, France, Germany, the European Union, have said, look, we're going to support South Africa's own plan to decarbonise its energy system, and we're going to provide finance and funding to support South Africa to do that, and technical assistance. And I think and I hope that this will be the first of many such country-owned partnerships where the support's provided to encourage and enable developing countries and emerging economies to transition as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's what's been the name of the game, hasn't it, all day today? It's about how you get that public and private money to come together to meet those environmental pledges. OK, thank you very much indeed, Felicia Jackson and Dr. Ben Caldecott. It's been really great having you in the studio with us this evening. Well, don't forget that you can listen to a new Climate Cast every day from COP26. That's wherever you normally find your podcasts. You may well already be watching this on our pop-up channel, But if you're not, you can find uninterrupted coverage from COP26 here in Glasgow between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Channel 525 all week. But do stay tuned. Up next, we have Mark Austin, who has a special programme live from Brazil on the climate crisis. Thanks for watching. Good night.